In this presentation, we're going to be discussing the importance of visualization strategies for contemporary design communication. But the reality is, I mean, we could exchange the word design for engineering, sales and marketing, HR, enterprise. It really doesn't matter. So it's essentially a culmination of events have brought into focus the need to ensure that the communication within our business and the communication strategy matches the changing demands of the current environment. So for many organizations, particularly the ones that have obviously continued over the course of this pandemic, visualization has become essentially the nervous system of their business. And these companies increasingly rely on visualization, and it's become a real vital part of their strategy. So the vis strategy that they have needs to be robust, it needs to be future-proofed, it needs to be dynamic enough to adapt to other disruptions that are on the horizon as well. So today we're going to be discussing sort of the key benefits of a vis strategy when it's viewed alongside other trends like sustainability, climate change, distributed teams, and also changing consumer demands. I'm going to help you understand how to spot, embrace, and protect against disruption. And we're also going to talk about how visualization can provide a level of agility in uncertain environments like we are in, and I think we're going to have more of them moving forward. I'll also try to finish up with some introductions to certain technologies that are changing the studios that we support, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about today. It's definitely about that philosophy. How do you develop a vis strategy? How do you deploy it? How do you implement it? And looking at the attendees, we've got a bit of a mixture, but I know we've got people across the entire spectrum. We've got people who are managers looking to get more from their vis tools that they have in the business. We've got a couple of vis artists that are working right at the kind of bleeding edge of this technology. And we've got a bit of a mixture in between as well. But my aim really is to provide you with a few frameworks today to help you guys to develop your vis strategies and make sure that they're positioned and developed in a way that are going to have a long-term positive effect on your business. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick John. I'm the Industrial Design and Vis Manager here at Symmetry. And I pretty much work as a subject matter expert predominantly for our automotive clients. I help to optimize and evolve processes in the design studio, but I work very closely with our manufacturing, architecture, and construction teams to support innovation and visualization there as well. We do have a small in-house development team, so we do build our own tools and technologies. We have a couple of tools that I might talk about today in the shape of our Sevilla Visualizer and our Sevilla Configurator. Essentially, my job is focused on developing digital design and vis strategies to help all of our clients, regardless of the industry, navigate the opportunities and threats of disruption. So I like to kind of put things into three categories, and it's the framework that I use with my own team, which is recognize, prioritize, and respond. We like to try and look quite far out at the trends that are going to influence the decisions that we make. I actually try to use things like the Gartner hype curve, which I'm not going to use for the first time in a while today, but if I can give you guys the tools to understand trends, it will help you develop a more robust system and also kind of accelerate your decision making. And then we'll finish up, as I said previously, with a little bit of the tech to be aware of, and if we get time, a little bit of a Q&A. And there are questions that you can try and send into the meeting at any point, and I'll try and refer to those at the end. So if there's anything that you see, anything you'd like me to kind of go back to, please feel free to jot those down. The first thing really is just kind of this little discussion on future proofing. Yeah, so people often think about how do you embrace disruption when it arrives. In reality, companies should try, where possible, to be proactive. We should look and try and anticipate what the future is going to bring and develop methods to minimize the shocks and stresses that that future event will have, because it's not always possible to embrace this disruption once it arrives, pandemic being a perfect example. As I said previously, I like to use the Gartner recognize, prioritize, and respond methodology. So essentially, once you recognize that something is going to happen or could take place, how do you kind of prioritize your action and then respond accordingly? So for many of you, you'll have teams that are trying to future-proof the processes. And for me, yes, future-proofing is definitely in part developing a really robust system, but true future-proofing is assuming there is going to be change and ensuring that you remain flexible and agile to respond when that change arrives. And visualization is a kind of a unique point for this. I think everyone's pretty familiar with this image. So something that happens quite regularly is that challenging and disruptive environments often highlight fragilities and potentially even an over-reliance on particular strategies, processes, or systems. And in business, nobody wants to be over-reliant on a single vendor, a single supplier, or a single process to maintain their business. And the reason I talk about this is because communication is no different. If you think of communication and visualization as a result of that, if you think of communication as a commodity, the transfer of wisdom, insight, and understanding between two or more parties, what happens when something severs that supply line? What happens when something prevents that information from being moved across? And what the pandemic forced us to ask was, do we need to be in the office? Do we need to sign things off in person? Do we need to create as many physical prototypes that people can't necessarily view in person? Do we need to travel as much? Are the security protocols that we've had for many, many years outdated? Is there an opportunity to deploy a multi-channel strategy instead? Can we change those needs to coulds? So rather than do you need to be in the office, could you be in the office? Could you be remote? Could you sign stuff off in person? Could you sign it off digitally? Do we need that physical prototype, or could we have a digital equivalent? And in terms of travel, the pandemic has shown us a lot of our customers just do not need to travel as much. It's pretty obvious. Remote collaboration and digital tools allow them to have the same level of awareness of progress, the same ability to communicate without having to wait and the cost associated to travel and everything else that comes with that. So a lot of those needs are definitely turned into coulds. So the question is, if we were to view our existing process through the prism of all the upcoming disruptions, how can we mitigate risk of any future single points of failure in our enterprise communication? Can we look at other trends to guide our strategy? For us, now looking at our customers, I wouldn't say it's a post-mortem, it's more of an intermortem. We're now looking at the as-is scenario. How have people responded to the pandemic? How have they got on with things? We can pretty much see a direct correlation between the companies with a visualization strategy and those who've deployed multi-channel communication methods versus those that haven't. The ones that have, they've got options, they've got a far more kind of robust and are better able to weather the storm of the pandemic and other upcoming disruptions. And we want to talk about how they've done that. But before we discuss any of those visualization tools, strategies, solutions, can we first spend a little bit of time understanding what exactly disruption is? And it's not just what is disruption. In fact, we've got to actually go and categorize disruption as well. So what we're going to spend a little bit of time now is helping you guys to develop your own strategies, understand what's important to you. And with a little bit of a framework that we use inside my department, I think you guys will understand how to recognize, prioritize, and respond. But interestingly, just before I get into that, I wanted to ask if people had heard of something called, or a phrase, should I say, called the innovator's dilemma. It's a really kind of tricky place for you to be within business. And it's a position that many of us find ourselves in right now. So the innovator's dilemma is a situation where you are aware of the changing dynamics surrounding your business, but do you stick or twist? It's essentially a long and short of it. And the pandemic has given us a glimpse into the future, or at least a potential future, of what we could do with the information that we've seen. So I don't think it's quite as binary as stick or twist, but the important thing to take away is that once you are aware of a changing dynamic, it's really dangerous not to come up with a plan. And the following tools and frameworks should give you a guide. So let's just go back to understanding what is disruption. So for us, there are 3 different types of change which people often regard as disruption, but not all of them are. And when you understand what disruption is, you're going to understand exactly what is going to impact you. You can predict it coming. Is it measurable? And you'll be able to prioritize your focus. But let's just go back to that thing. There's 3 different types of change. You have features, we have fads, and we have disruption. Let's talk about what they are. If I talk about features, a feature is something that is added and evolves to your tool stack every year. It's consistent, it's cumulative, it grows over time. This could be something like the software that we use as an example, or the operating system on your smartphone. You just expect it to update and improve over time. There's nothing that happens that's so revolutionary that you have to make a big change with those updates. They're very important, but I wouldn't say they drive true disruption. So we need to understand that something could be a feature. And then we have fads. So fads often have a kind of societal trigger. They have a much bigger shock. So much bigger shock to the society, to the system. Something happens that makes a community really excited, and it can have a really large impact, to be honest. but it can really quickly disappear and reduce that impact very quickly. It never fully takes across the entirety of the spectrum, right the way from innovators through to the laggards, but it might have a real sort of cult following in some places. So an example might be something like Pokemon Go, for example, or Vines. But neither of these two things are true disruption. Features and fads can be important, but they're not true disruption. True disruption is far more kind of consuming. It has multiple triggers. It could be societal, economic, technologic triggers coming together to make a really big impact that spikes and makes a kind of big, meaningful change to the target market and beyond. And unlike fads, disruption stays until something else disrupts it. So it's a real fundamental shift in behaviors. So an example could be something like streaming replacing broadcast TV, or it could be electric vehicles and mobility as a service replacing the traditional transport industry. There's also lots of secondary impacts as well. So for example, if we're all driving EVs and we're all using autonomous vehicles, do we need to have as many car parks? Do we need a different type of infrastructure? So big disruption has kind of a primary influence, but then it also has secondary influences. And then once you've recognized what the disruption is, you need to scale it. So how big is that disruption in the grand scheme of things? And that perspective lets us get an idea of where the disruption sits in the kind of historic disruptions that you can look at it alongside. So I've used the kind of COVID pandemic as an example here. And because we're in it, the magnitude feels massive. It feels like it would be up in this kind of revolutionized area. But in my personal opinion, and we can kind of debate this afterwards, I think it's more in this transform, maybe even reinvent area. So the pandemic has been objectively awful, but depending on where you're from, your perspective would be very different. If you're from certain Asian countries, this might be your fourth pandemic in the last 30 years. And yes, it will have a big influence on change moving forward, but is it the kind of disruption that World War II or the Industrial Revolution had? I don't think so. Has it kind of created fundamental change for all of us? Yes, I'd agree with that. If I was trying to look at something that I'd say is revolutionary, something has the massive magnitude, I'd say climate change would be that. Whether you're a strong believer in that or not, climate change is a kind of once in a millennia event. It's something that has a touch point at every single part of society. And then I've got something like environmental, social, and governance, which is part of climate change, but this is also something which we're seeing is affecting the way that the companies that we support go about things. So I should really have mentioned there, these are the societal disruptions that we see coming up. But then we've also got a few digital disruptions. So for those of you who are aware of these phrases, we've got things like the metaverse, digital twins, XR collaboration. I've said XR collaboration, but that really could be virtual reality or AR, but extended reality collaboration, extended reality democratization, so the price point becoming far more acceptable for many people. And although I've written BIM here, I do really mean just the proliferation of 3D content. So there's certain industries, if you're from manufacturing or automotive, we're very much used to having 3D data, but if you're from architecture and construction, they've only really in the last decade moved to 3D content. But the beauty of this means that now that there's 3D content flooding pretty much every single sector, it makes it a lot easier for us to move into high-end visualization. Now that we understand how to look for disruption, we understand how to categorize it. Let's just put a few more on the board now. Now that we can look at the disruptions that we mentioned earlier, but I've also added a few more that are on the horizon that are driving change. We've got primary disruptions like the pandemic or democratized technology or climate change, but I've also added some second order effects to those disruptions, things like decentralized teams and globally kind of distributed teams, something that has definitely been a result of the pandemic or has accelerated due to the pandemic. So second order effects are really difficult things to predict. So an example might be, people said that once email becomes the main way of sending information, the mail service or the traditional Royal Mail service would cease to exist. But the reality of it is we actually send more mail than ever now. So trying to think of those second order effects is very important, but it's not an exact science. But one thing that the pandemic did was accelerate this thesis, and it gave us an opportunity to see how things might play out. For example, we now know that companies or at least some companies anyway, have permanently shut their head offices. So how are they going to collaborate? We know that the gig and freelance economy is boomed this year. So we know that the appetite for remote workers has also increased. We know that security, to a certain extent, has been relaxed. Depends on the sector, obviously. But I've worked in industries that have flat said we will not be able to work remotely on mobile workstations, but this year that has been kind of disproved. But now that you've got a number of your disruptions on the board, yours might be slightly different. You might add different ones in here. You need to categorize and prioritize them. So if you're company A, your main things might be climate change, the metaverse, and digital twin. Company B might be, we want to use VR collaboration. Now that 5G, or at least enterprise level 5G, is of a certain level, we can take advantage of that. And the pandemic has affected our working practices. That might be your priority. Different company might be something different. You have to have a small number of goals. You can't try and boil the ocean by addressing all of them. You just need to pick a few different disruptions that you build your strategy around. And once you do that, then you can start understanding which tools and technologies that you will be deploying within your business. But what I'm going to do now is just focus on a couple of those macro trends, because the more we understand about certain things that are influencing, I guess, customer demands and expectations, you start understanding why it's really important to make sure that your visualization strategy addresses those things within your business. So it's just an example, but one of those macro trends is something called dispersion. It's happening all around us. It's affecting pretty much every touch point in society, but dispersion is the process of skipping traditional distribution points to connect the source or the supplier of value to the stakeholder. So an example for some of us who are quite used to things like this. So fast food restaurants used to be fast food, but people want faster food. So we have things like Uber Eats and Deliveroo. For entertainment, people would go to the cinemas. Now we have Netflix and Prime and various other streaming services. Politics, people used to read the paper and get a few different sources. Now it's retweets and shares. Fashion, used to go to the shops. Now we order it. Money, open banking and Bitcoin pretty much show us that you don't need to go to bricks and mortar stores anymore. You can pretty much do all of that digitally. And relationships, yeah, we've got Tinder, just as an example. So if you feel like you're immune to those trends, yeah, congratulations. But the purpose of this presentation is to understand which trends and which disruptions are going to affect us moving forward. So moving forward, you have to think about new staff. You have to think about new suppliers. For us, or for us of a certain vintage anyway, we'll have grown up understanding there was an alternative. But for that Generation Z, or for the younger audience, this is completely normal. They expect things quickly. So visualization and being able to understand and get that information very quickly becomes even more important. Then we've got ESG. And environmental social governance might not seem like it, but this is a really, really important trend that I think we had a bit of a turning point on this year. And for those of you who might not be aware of it, think of ESG as the equivalent of a kind of nutrition label on your food products, or an energy performance certificate on a house. But environmental, social, and governance audits are pretty much an audit of all the practices of a department or an entire company. It refers to three central factors: measuring sustainability, societal impact, and the organization of a business. And it's an easy way, or you can imagine an easy way to improve your ESG score would be to adopt certain digital communication alternatives to complement physical or traditional methods. And this can reduce waste, we can reduce shipping, reduce tooling, reduce toxic materials, reduce prototyping, and you can potentially even market your products that you might be designing predominantly digitally as well. Another bit of a turning point as well, although the pandemic definitely took most of the headlines this year, or last year should I say. Last year was actually the first time that Europe saw most of its electricity generated from renewable resources rather than fossil fuels. So you can really see it's a mega trend. It's happening everywhere. Investors are investing in companies based on their ESG scores. Customers are buying products based on their ESG scores. And as a society, we are now kind of moving away from those traditional fossil fuels, although they're going to be there for a long time, to these more renewable equivalence. And if you're not sure about ESG, I recommend you go and have a look at a few companies' standards and strategy, because the automotive industry have made it very clear that they're going to be moving to EV or EV equivalents, or at least a combination of ICE engines and EV platforms for their business. And they've set very kind of aggressive goals: 2025 for Volvo, 2030 for Bentley, 2025 for Jaguar. But then we saw even more interesting things like Netflix and Amazon and Uber. They also have ESG strategies, and other customers as well. So if you look around, you'll notice that this isn't just an isolated thing to the automotive industry or to manufacturing. It's pretty much across the board. And it will also be important for your C-suite and directors as well. But I wanted to get away from ESG and just concentrate on a particular business to take that a step further. So some customers and some companies in the automotive sector have already had a huge shift towards electrification and sustainability and mobility. You've got companies like Polestar, who are a ground-up EV company. You've got Charge Cars, who are working in collaboration with Arrival to retrofit the most advanced electric drivetrains to some iconic chassis like the Mustang. Jaguar, I said a moment ago, have kind of made aggressive, ambitious strategies to hit an all EV range by 2025. And you've pretty much seen recently that Lotus have been reborn as an EV company, moving forward with the £2 million hypercar, the Evija. But I do want to concentrate on Arrival, because it's one thing to have an aggressive ESG strategy, but it's another to go even further. So for a company like Arrival, to the outside, it might look like they're just, simply changing the philosophy and adapting, or should I say, adopting electric drivetrains to meet CO2 targets. But the reality is these companies are being built from the ground up to achieve net zero carbon emissions. So not just looking to bring a product to market with zero tailpipe emissions. This is sustainable design processes, new technologies, alternative recyclable materials. Even the manufacturing process is completely different to the incumbents. So all of these Arrival vehicles are produced in small volume, small footprint, low cost micro factories, instead of the traditional kind of big assembly lines. So this kind of makes this a full process of kind of ESG and a clean processing for every single thing that they do within the business. And this includes design. So you can see now that some companies are kind of doing a little bit, some companies are doing a bit more, but other companies are pretty much redeveloping themselves to be a complete clean business to meet these trends. And this also includes the design, engineering, sales and marketing processes as well. And visualization is a brilliant way to solve a lot of those problems. So let's talk about some of those solutions. Let's talk about some of the ways that you guys can use visualization to address these new challenges. For many of you, VR is not new. For some of you, it might be. But for those companies that haven't adopted it or investigated it, I suggest that you do. So adopting a viz strategy like this, you can see here, to include VR means that companies are capable of reviewing their data at scale, quickly identifying issues typically associated to physical properties. You don't have to wait for calendars to align. You don't have to wait for prototypes to be tooled. You can use VR collaboration on demand, and you can pretty much conduct transcontinental remote design reviews with your team immediately. And I know that there's a couple of you on the call that are already doing this and have developed your own platforms, which is brilliant. But the good thing about this is once you have kind of deployed a process like this, you don't just reduce waste and cost associated to physical prototypes. You also reduce all of those hidden costs as well that you typically associate to face-to-face stakeholder meetings. So this can be shipping, storage, insurance, hotels, travel, meals. This isn't just, oh, we're going to reduce physical prototypes by introducing VR. There is a huge number of second order effects that we spoke about earlier that can have a massive impact on the business, massive positive impact on the business. Another good thing about this is if we're going to have globally distributed teams, VR also kind of removes a lot of barriers. If you're separated by thousands of miles, if you've got language barriers or time zones, all of that can be removed at the same time, as you're achieving all of these sustainable targets. So it really is a two for one. Now, I'm not saying VR is perfect, because it isn't, but it has transformed the way that a number of people have worked, that our customers anyway, that they work. So I understand that some people feel that the VR headsets can be slightly isolating. They can create a sort of disconnected experience in some cases. And for some people, they didn't feel that VR necessarily facilitates communication with those outside of VR. And I completely take all of this on board. It's quite difficult to engage with virtual content and the physical environment at the same time. So VR is not always perfect, and certain visualization strategies aren't always perfect. But the one thing I wanted to take away is don't let the pursuit of improvement be the issue. Don't let perfection get in the way of good. You have to kind of take steps to improve those processes, and you can definitely do it by implementing these low-cost solutions. But for those of you who have already used VR and are looking to graduate a little bit higher than that, do have other technologies that we've seen our customers using within this last kind of tricky period in the pandemic. In my opinion, the best-in-class headset is definitely the Vario XR3. And the beauty of the XR3 is it removes many of the issues I just spoke about by enabling seamless extended reality experiences and allowing you to take advantage of the pass-through cameras, hand tracking, LiDAR that are all built into these headsets. So fundamentally, the difference here is that users are connected to both the virtual and the physical environment. And I'm really proud of my team working with companies across defense, automotive, industrial design, manufacturing, training, human resources to create experiences that take full advantage of things like the Vario equipment and allow those companies to better leverage the value of their 3D assets that they have within their businesses. A little bit more expensive, but far less expensive than you guys would think, especially comparing it to some of the historic tools that we've implemented at other companies. But for those of you who kind of know the team, we work closely with partners as well. One of those partners is a company called Future Visual. So that kind of covers that design review side of things, but let's think about high risk environments or HR or training assets. And the company we work closely with, a company called Future Visual, have developed a really interesting platform which allows you to connect all of your devices. So VR, AR, mobile devices, workstations, and to help collaborate in these disruptive environments, but providing those multi-channel communication strategies. One example I'll use here is the IATA plane example. And hopefully this plays okay. So what's happening here is it's very difficult to train somebody the complexities of being on the apron and the pre-flight checks and things like that, because the reality of these high-risk environments, be that a nuclear environment, here it's obviously the apron of an airport, it could be an oil rig. You don't really see the hazards that often, especially physically. So what we can do here is look at all of those hazardous scenarios and really educate users on how to identify those problems, how to respond to them. And on the other side of this particular experience is an expert recording how they perform. So the user is getting the ability to go and kind of get that muscle memory of understanding what to look for, what the issues are. But at the same time, there is an expert reviewing them in a different location, which could be in a different country. It could be at headquarters, whereas the user could be at home or at a training center. And this massively improves and expands the number of people who would be able to connect and communicate with this experience. Everybody wins, everybody increases their ability to perform a given service, and the company gets to avoid any insurance costs of people being on the apron doing some random pre-flight checks. But that's an example of high-risk environments. So it's not just design reviews, this could be training. And another example of the guys at Future Visual is their XR platform, which is, again, hopefully these play. First time using this platform. which, as you'll see in a moment, this is bringing the whole team together globally through any device that they have access to. So we've got HoloLens, HTC Vives, other standalone headsets, and everyone collaborating in the same environment at the same time. And you can imagine this is not replacing exactly what it'd be like to be at headquarters or at a centralized office, but it is expanding that communication so that you have an option to maintain lines of communication regardless of where you are and what device you have as well. And for us, this is definitely the direction of travel, is ensuring that everybody can interact with these assets at the same time with really clear lines of communication, and there's no over-reliance on a specific piece of equipment. Definitely the way forward. It's not always the way forward for enterprise, but for many companies, it's a brilliant way to go. And then finally, I'd say this is a bit of a late addition to this presentation, but it is certainly the thing that my team and I am most excited about, which is some of the big players getting involved to what is called the future of communication. And I believe it was last year, NVIDIA introduced something called the Omniverse platform, which is pretty unique in that it essentially allows teams to work together interactively using their own 3D tool of choice. So all of the things you've seen previously are us putting data into a platform and then distributing the experience. Whereas the difference with Omniverse is that if I'm using 3ds Max and my colleague is using Inventor, my colleague is using CATIA, my other colleague or supplier is using a different tool, maybe Revit, we can all collaborate in the Omniverse at the same time, in real time, using our own tools, which is completely bonkers because no vendor has been able to allow or generate that themselves. So you've got data for multiple applications seamlessly being streamed into the Omniverse, resulting in an asset, which could be a building, could be a product, could be a factory, could be a car, and everyone's interacting with it in real time, potentially even ray traced in the viewport supported by the NVIDIA Quadro RTX GPUs. But the reason why I've added this one is because I think it's a brilliant explanation of what that vision into the future will look like from BMW. So apologies, I haven't added sound here because I think it pretty much speaks for itself. And you'll realize the number of touch points that have been interacted in here. So it could be game engines, as you can see here. It could be a little bit of point cloud data and scan data, 3D assets, robots, avatars, which, as you'll see in a moment, these aren't just little mannequins. What you've got here is an expert on the work cells who's going through the human factors in a motion capture suit, optimizing the performance and the positioning of where certain elements of the cell need to be. And all of this is being captured in Omniverse. So this is really interesting because normally people use things like Jack and Jill and other avatar-based things. Here we've got a real human expert on that factory line doing the job, explaining exactly where things need to be. That information is being captured, being stored, and as you'll see in a moment, being implemented onto the Omniverse platform and captured to show all of those different scenarios or different roles on that line. And now we can see all of that activity happening in real time, and we can optimize, or at least BMW can optimize how things work. And this is a real glimpse into the future, a platform that delivers on every single part of the design review, optimization, collaboration, single source of truth. So in the same way that PLM and PDM systems are about accessibility and organization, visualization is about communication and always has been, but with developments like this, it's far more than than your traditional communication, because now we're seeing every single potential scenario that you might see. Really, really, really interesting stuff. And I'd recommend that anybody, if you get an opportunity, please go and have a look at the Omniverse being discussed at GTC, because there's far more examples from different sectors on show there. But you've even got the robots. But so I think that gives us a little bit of time. Obviously, we've talked about what a disruption or a disruptive upcoming event is, how to categorize that disruption, how do you prioritize it, and then it's a case of how do you respond. And just going back to the slide earlier on where we discussed what is going to build your scenario, you will need to go and look at all of the different things. For us in the UK here, I know we've got people from Europe on the call, but for us in the UK, obviously Brexit is a big thing. Are we going to really ship things around? Can we rely on that supply chain that we had previously for prototypes? I've definitely been in at least 2 scenarios where we haven't been able to, and visualization has now become the primary tool where possible. But everyone's priorities are going to be different, but you will need to create a little map like this to really take advantage of the opportunities available. Please, please, please feel free to reach out and discuss any of the technologies that were discussed or any of the frameworks if you want to talk about them in more depth. We're obviously work very closely with Vario, so for those that are interested in that, please reach out as well. And for everyone else, if you're not linked in with me on LinkedIn, please feel free to find me, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversations from there. But until then, hopefully you've taken something away from this presentation, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day.